Hi, Mr. McLeod here. This is Chapter 22 on World War II. In this video, I want to ask why people comply with bad laws, talk about D-Day and the impact on Europe, the war in the Pacific, and then some final thoughts. Let's talk about the coronavirus, which seems to have nothing to do with World War II. In the paper this week, I read to help slow the spread of the virus, many states have enacted stay-at-home orders for residents and ordered schools and all non-essential businesses to close. So the obvious question here is, why do we comply with the orders of governmental leaders? I mean, this thing is really economically disruptive to our country. Millions of people have been put out of work in the last 2 weeks, and it's just made our lives difficult. And why do we comply with this? Well, we comply because we're concerned about our health. Okay, so this isn't, the government hasn't asked us to do anything that is immoral or against our religion right now, but they're doing this really not even to protect us from getting the virus, you or me, but really just to slow down the spread of the virus so that hospitals are not overwhelmed. And there's a biblical model for this because there's many places in the Bible, such as here in Hebrews 13, where it says, "Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account." The Apostle Paul makes several statements like those in his letters as well. But also there's a natural resistance to resist governmental leadership or others. For example, in Proverbs 26:17, it says, "Whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears." And so we are naturally inclined to obey the laws as long as they're not too uncomfortable, and even sometimes if they are a little bit uncomfortable. And if you think about it, in the 30s with the secret police, the Gestapo in Germany, not obeying the law was potentially risky, both of financial ruin and even your life. And so there was definitely a reason to want to comply with the law, even if it made you a little bit uncomfortable. But sometimes you do have to break the law. And Peter and the apostles, this is in the book of Acts, were arrested by the Jewish leaders for preaching the gospel. And they simply said, we must obey God rather than men. So there are times when you just have to disobey. And so this is a shout out to those Christians who put their lives at risk in order to protect Jews, like the Ten Boom family, one of the most famous groups. And they did eventually pay with their lives for protecting the Jews. So let's talk about the D-Day and the beginning of the end for Germany. By 1944, the war had been going on for 5 years, and Germany had occupied all of Western Europe, except for those areas that were still neutral or allied with Germany. But all of the allies, France, England, United States, etc., were not on the mainland. And so they were planning, they knew they had to retake it. And so for a year, they planned this landing, which they picked this specific day because of full moon and high tides. And they had actually spent months trying to deceive the Germans to think they were going to be landing about 100 miles further to the east, where England and France were much closer together. But this was the largest sea landing in history, included almost 7,000 craft. These are soldiers leaving the ships going to the beach. They can't bring the ships right into the beach because of mines and other obstructions that the Germans had put in the water all along the coast of France, the entire coast of France, to prevent ships from landing for this very reason. And if you look at the back of this picture, you'll see a bluff. There's a hill up there, and it's a couple of 100 feet high. And German garrisons were stationed up there, fairly small ones, because this area was actually not very well defended. The town of Bayeux is closest town to the landing, and you remember this because we've talked about the Bayeux Tapestry from the year 1070 when William the Conqueror from Normandy sailed across the English Channel and conquered the English throne. In June 6th of 2019, they had the 75th anniversary of the Normandy landing, and so there was a huge celebration here. And so the town had painted these pictures just to honor the people that were coming, and there were thousands of people that came for these events. So the D-Day statistics, 160,000 troops crossed on that one day alone, which is just amazing that this could happen. And in the first month, 875,000 men came. And this really began the conquest of Western Europe, and they were able to push their way back to Berlin. And it took them about a year to end that war. This is the American cemetery. All of the countries that participate in the battle have their own cemetery in this area, but the American cemetery is the largest because about 6,000 to 7,000 of the casualties, the fatalities, during the Normandy landings were Americans out of about 10,000 total casualties on all sides, including the Germans have a cemetery there as well. Let's talk about the war in the Pacific. There's really two separate wars. The European War and the Pacific War were two separate wars. The United States was the only country that was heavily involved in both of them. Britain was involved to some extent because their navy was involved. And this is the Pacific here. And as you know, it's a big, big, big body of water. And so the Pacific battle was primarily a naval battle versus the European battle, which was primarily a land battle. So Japan is here, and they were a rising industrial power and wanted to be seen as a big industrial power. And this circle of blue represents the greatest sphere of influence during the war, which is about in 1942. But in the years leading up to Pearl Harbor and the war in the Pacific, Japan had already conquered and occupied this part of China as well as Korea and Taiwan. And then during the war after 1941, they had also occupied all of these places. And the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was on December 7th in 1941, was timed to coincide with the attack on Singapore and Hong Kong and other places down here. And so they did this, they were all timed to happen in the same day in hopes of preventing communications from alerting any of them that that was going to happen. So when they attacked Pearl Harbor, they were not at war with the United States. And so it was an attack in time of peace, which is, typically not how you run a war, as if there are rules in war, but actually turned out to benefit the Americans in a big way. And so they sent about half their fleet over here to do this surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. So keep in mind, this is before radar and other things. You actually could move a navy across the ocean without anybody noticing it, which you certainly could not do today. This is Pearl Harbor right here. It's a great harbor for ships because there's lots of water, and this is the home of the Pacific Fleet. And so you've got the harbor here, and this is the Navy base right here in the center, and the ships are all around it, and many of them are stacked up. You see these ships are actually stacked up next to each other, which is a common way of parking ships. And this actually proved to be very beneficial to the Americans, because what happened was the Japanese thought that they could deal a knockout blow to the Americans. They would scare them, and they'd realize how superior we are, and they're going to just not come to war against us, which of course they don't understand American resolve. But had they known about the attack, the American fleet would have gone out to sea and met the incoming attackers at sea. And there the loss in ships would have been potentially tremendous, because they would have definitely been overpowered by the Japanese Navy. But instead, the ships were here, and some of the biggest ships, aircraft carriers, were not in port at the time, and so they were saved. But also, of the 18 ships that were sunk here, 17 of them they were able to repair and raise, because they were only in 20 or 30 feet of water. So all they had to do was repair the damage from the torpedoes and bombs, pump out the water, and then they could bring the ships up and repair them. And again, had they been at sea, they would have lost those ships entirely. Also, because they were in port, a great number of the sailors that were on these ships were not on the ships at the time. They were in barracks on land. And so the loss of life was a lot less than it would have been had the battle occurred at sea. Now, Japan made a huge blunder here. They did 2 waves of bombings, and they took out a lot of the airplanes on the Air Force Base, which is near here, and the ships as well, but they didn't attack the administrative facilities and the fuel tanks over here. And had they done that, which they should have done, and they knew they could have and should have done, they would have really dealt a significant blow. But all they did was temporarily stop the ships. But as soon as the United States was able to get more ships from the Pacific coast, they were back in business. But without fuel and other resources, it would have been a much bigger setback, because transporting extensive amount of fuel across the Pacific is a much more difficult task. So this is the USS Enterprise, which was out to sea at the time, and so it was undamaged. And this is at the Battle of Midway, which was just 7 months later. And Midway here is the westernmost of the Hawaiian Islands, and this proved to be the decisive naval battle in the Pacific War. So this was about 7 months later, and they were planning a second surprise attack, because all of their other attacks were happening down here, and this was what they were trying to gain control over. But they thought, if we could take out the Midway Navy station, then we could really deal a knockout blow, because they were still under this belief that they could prevent the U.S. from getting involved in the war, because the response from the U.S. to this point had been fairly minor, because they were rebuilding. But the U.S. intercepted and interpreted their messages. They anticipated the attack, so they were able to attack the incoming force while they were not ready. And it was a devastating blow to Japan, and they lost 4 of their aircraft carriers, which was half of their fleet. and a lot of their other ships. And it takes time to build ships, and it takes time to train pilots. And so it was really um, a blow that Japan never recovered from. And from that point on, for the rest of the 3 years, they were more defensive than offensive. And the United States and Britain kept coming in closer and closer. And then they, just like they did in Germany, began bombing raids to destroy the industrial infrastructure of Japan. And being an island, since they had to import everything they needed, not being able to get fuel and industrial supplies and even food, really just began to choke Japan more and more. So German blunders in World War II, one was supporting Italy. It was probably just a big mistake. Italy was never as committed to the war as Germany and Japan were, and this cost Germany a lot of energy. Attacking Russia cost Germany a tremendous amount of people and leadership and resources that ultimately prevented them from succeeding on the Western Front. And they had unrealistic and changing goals. They're just to conquer all of Europe is a rather vague goal. And so the army just kept pushing and pushing with no real chance to win. Japanese blunders in World War II was simply underestimating the USA's strength and resolve, seriously underestimating their strength and resolve, and overestimating the strength and power of their own Navy. And also poor coordination between the Navy and the Army. The Army was responsible for landing on all of the islands and mainland on the Western Pacific Rim, but it was the Navy that had to get them there and also to stop the U.S. and British forces. And this created tension between the leadership groups and their desires in how to win the battle. So let me wrap up by saying this. After World War II, Germany and Japan became among our biggest allies, and their economies grew from complete devastation to be the third and second largest by the time of 1970, so just about 25 years after the war. And they reigned there until China overtook both of them in 2010 to become the world's second largest economy. But keep in mind, China's population is 10 times Japan's population. So while their economy is bigger, their per capita income is still just a fraction of what Japan's is. But the reason Germany and Japan became economic powerhouses is because their entire industrial infrastructure was destroyed in the war. And so the United States helped fund and rebuild the countries to prevent the things that happened after World War I, the economic devastation. And as a result, Germany and Japan's industrial infrastructure was all new, primarily because of the desire to prevent the spread of communism in Russia and China. And so Japan and Germany were looked at as buffers to them because they're both adjacent to those communist countries. And so the United States had a vested interest in that. And that's actually what we're going to cover next week with the Cold War. So thanks for listening.